drone was.
I can. I have that information handy. I've been looking into this. So what that was a TU-141 drone. Now these are not drones like you might think of in the conventional sense. Essentially, what these are, they're basically small unmanned planes. They're more similar to that. They're launched off of a launch platform via rocket, and then they have a small turbine engine that powers them.
Similar to a V2 in
These
practice.
these are from 1971. These are not likely to be something that is useful as a modern reconnaissance aircraft. So it makes much more sense that they would be essentially using up these old drones that are just sitting around doing nothing as converted bombs, because they're already very similar to a rocket in nature, as that's essentially what they are.
The V2 bombing from the Germans on Britain during the Second World War, the V2 bomb, similar in threat and panic. No.
They did find on this drone that went down in Croatia the red five-pointed star, which was the symbol for Soviet aircraft.
Just to drive that home, the picture in the Wikipedia article that was just posted in Situation Room, that's from a museum.
Yeah, I was. What I was doing is I was getting, of course, a reference for that, so people can have a look at what sort of this what it was.
Yeah, I was just pointing out these are literally museum pieces that they're throwing all around.
Yeah, I think it was intended, to be honest, and the one in Poland today, is intended to test NATO's air defenses and reaction times, and if there was any reaction whatsoever. That's my belief. The conjecture is based off from what I've read in regards to Russia's strategy from the Atlantic and other sources I've read. So I think it's just whoever's launching is just testing the reaction of the NATO air defenses.
So my question is, why are they choosing something so old and so obsolete? I mean, Russia has claimed that they have not had any of these in their active arsenal since 1991. So, I mean, does that
probing
desperation that they're using something so old?
It's for probing.
I think it's a probing situation because even with the initial ground assaults, I mean, people are citing the victories of the Ukrainian troops against the Russians that initially invaded. And yes, they have made considerable progress fighting the Russians off. But we're talking about 4,000 of the Russian troops out of the 200,000 they had along their border at the end of their so-called training exercise. They very well could not be launching what they have in their full capability, in their full potential arsenal. This could just be very well. They have them in their arsenal. They could probe with them, and it's not a huge loss when they get shot down. And realistically, I don't even think that these drones that they, like the one crashing Croatia, if that one has camera capabilities. I don't know if someone could confirm that.
It does have camera capabilities, but the problem with it is that the camera needs to be recovered later because this is old technology. To someone who asked why they would fly them, it's because it has the same speed and radar signature of a jet, so it's plausible that NATO air defense would interpret it as a jet and respond accordingly.
Could you chuck a GoPro on it? I'm just thinking out loud, like something cheap and that would send a signal back to Russia or whoever's handling it to get the information. I mean,
do we have any confirmation as to what the drone was that went down over Poland? Was it the same model, like a Tu-141, or?
It is closer in make and model to like a Predator or Bayraktar. It is one of the modern Russian drones. And I think, and this is pure speculation, that it is there to do reconnaissance on Western ally supply routes and convoys to get better information on how it can strike and what's coming in.
Interesting deniable plausibility in there between using the two different kinds. They know that the Ukrainians also had that older version, so it kind of throws like the dirt in the air of like who did it. See, we're using these more recent designs, so I don't know. It's interesting. Maybe more of a five-head play than they would do, but I think there's some interesting reasons to believe that it could have been both.
Well, I believe the Ukrainian version is a modernized version, whereas the stuff the Russians are throwing around hasn't even been repainted since the fall of the Soviet Union.
I just find it interesting that they're now starting to kind of probe into the Ukrainian airspace now. We're seeing them use these outdated Soviet drones to do that. Again, I mean, it's kind of pretty obvious when we see them using this outdated equipment that that's what they're using it for, because they know it's going to get shot down. They know it's going to go down in certain areas, and we've seen that the Ukrainian air defense system is pretty resilient. So I think that adds up. It makes sense. That's what they're using these for. Okay, so Vladinator actually just posted another article here that I'll get on screen of the Russian drone. I believe this is the one. This is closer to the one that landed in Poland, if I'm not mistaken, right?
This is I don't know the because of course got to keep in mind that you've said many times, Omni on the streams. Got to keep in mind the where this information is coming from and the information more that's going on both sides. But this is an article from Ukraine form. Supposedly they talk to the Ukrainian Air Force, and they say that these sort of drones are consistently breaching airspace. It is said to be a Russia's four-post type UAV complex. There's several pictures I'm looking at. It looks like definitely like a modern type drone that's available in their arsenal.
And just to jump in here, U.S. News posted an article that Croatia officials criticized NATO after it crashed, after the Russian drone crashed, because didn't it go over 3 NATO countries?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
and there's a perfect example of probing, because now they can see that they can fly drones freely, and NATO's got a sub-therapeutic response to that.
It's ridiculous.
I could just imagine the NATO radar monitors are just like, oh yeah, there's seems to be a Russian the heat signature that seems to be a Russian jet. Maybe we should do something about this.
There is a salient point that I want to bring up from our last panel, where a former member of the U.S. government, I can't remember their exact position at the moment, brought up the topic of create a hypothesis of what your opponent is going to do, and then work backwards from that hypothesis of what are the signals that they are going to do that. So, now that we're working in the opposite direction of that workflow, what are the scenarios that these drones could signal?
Probing.
Well, yes, it is probing, but what does probing signal moving forward?
Obviously, further escalations against Ukrainian air defense targets, most likely.
Reconnaissance before action.
Yeah, 4 days before the crash in Croatia, Orban, the Hungarian PM, allowed NATO to start amassing troops in the western part of the country.
The probability that the probing event was to find something out?
Yes, we're at that stage, but Are we going to see a greater increase of strikes on supply convoys, on Lviv, right next to the Polish border? What do we think that this probing is meant to really gain intel for the what action is Russia planning to take?
Well, they're obviously looking at what type of air defense systems they're using to down these drones that they're using to take a look around, and they're also looking for what positions they're firing at these drones from, so that they can most likely launch airstrikes on those targets, or maybe even send in forces, sabotage forces, to take out some of those air defense assets on the ground. And so the only way for them to know where those are located or what type of systems they're using, they need to send in a probe like this to to find them, to spot them out and get them painted for either an airstrike or against sabotage possibly.
And
I will say this might also be this might also be Russia planning for the potential outcome of NATO calling for a no-fly zone. Because if you know where the fucking missile defense batteries are, and the the different radar stations, locations, etc., then what you might need to take out in the event that your planes start getting shot down. Just potential thought.
And I had a thought when whoever was speaking just before you said the purpose of this. That might be why there was no response to this. It's possible that NATO realized what was going on and they decided purposefully to ignore this drone so as to not play their hand in terms of their capabilities. They may very well have called Russia's bluff on that, and that's why there was no response.
Did we get a confirmed casualty count out of the training building that was struck there? That NATO, where those NATO contractors were. Did we get a confirmed casualty count on that? Nope. Anybody?
Open according to the Sun news. I have an article opened up. So the airstrike which blasted the Yavorov military base near Lviv killed at least 35 people and injured another 134. Russian forces fired more than 30 cruise missiles at the base, prompting authorities to warn Vladimir Putin could start provoking NATO countries.
So was it confirmed that there were NATO members at that base?
35 people and at least 35 people and another 134 injured.
What about NATO members?
They didn't specify whether they were from NATO or Ukrainian.
Okay, yeah, because I remember there was originally speculation that there might have been like some NATO personnel or maybe contractors on site there. They did say that there was like foreign trainers there on site. I thought.
I read an article that said there were 3 ex-U.S. British special forces there.
The White House press secretary answered. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
That sadly might have passed away.
Go ahead, Ivy.
The White House press secretary answered that question in kind of a vague way. That it was worded just like that. Were there any members of NATO harmed in that attack? And her response was, nobody officially tied to any NATO government agency was, or working under a government agency. So basically saying like, not confirming whether or not there were NATO, like people from NATO countries, but making sure to say like they weren't there for official government reasons. They were there of their own accord.
Yeah, they can't.
I think that the people, from what I've read about it, and which confirms what you're saying and what the White House said, is basically I think the people who have died, who if they are nationals who have volunteered to fight in Ukraine, and they were training there. I can't remember the exact source, but I heard it recently on the many things I read and such. But yeah, that's from my knowledge. Going back to just the previous question, I just want to just say something briefly. I think that the drones that go into Poland Usually from a particularly with the drone that went all the way to Croatia, usually if there was a unknown flight coming from Ukraine, you would deploy jets straight away, or you would want to identify the aircraft visually, or alternatively find out what type of aircraft it is, in order to see what's breaching your airspace. But an unidentified craft breaching airspace, particularly NATO's airspace, would have been considered quite a big threat. So I wonder if there was any, what altitude it was flying at, what visual confirmation NATO commanders on the ground would have seen to be able to distinguish this from, say, a MiG jet from Russia to the drone. So that's I think something that hasn't necessarily been clarified and of course isn't in the news. But I do wonder whether that's something that occurred. And I think that information, nevertheless, even if it's not said publicly, that information, I'm sure Russia's taking notes and China's taking notes on those things.
So I'd like to get started on the topic that I had prepared for tonight, which, while it may not be the most appealing, is incredibly critical to the furtherance of Ukrainian resistance. And this is the Ukrainian power grid and Russian cyber attacks. The NEMICO panel discussion. For a little bit of background information for our viewers and all of our participants, since 2017, Ukraine's national grid operator has sought to cut ties with the Russian electrical grid, and instead they've been seeking to synchronize their electrical grid with the European grid. Ironically, on February 24th, the day of the invasion, they were conducting their first practiced disconnection from the Russian grid. Following the invasion, Ukraine petitioned the European grid for emergency synchronization with the continental European power system. And while approval has not yet been given, the European grid operator has released a statement saying that the exceptional efforts of the Ukrainian grid to operate and maintain their power system in these difficult times is commendable, and they vowed to continue supporting Ukraine. So currently, the Ukrainian grid is in this very dangerous isolation mode. It means it's not connected to any external grid, which means that it's incredibly vulnerable to outages and blackouts and, Russians seizing the largest nuclear plant in your country. And the Wall Street Journal reports that it could take several weeks to accommodate the emergency request and hook Ukraine up to the European grid. Now, from a cyber threat standpoint, this is alarming for two reasons. First, there is renewed fear that Russian-linked hackers may target the Ukrainian grid for the third time. They targeted the grid in 2015 and took parts of it down, and then they targeted again in 2016 and took parts of it down again. Secondly, assuming that Europe grants the Ukraine grid operator's request to connect to the European grid, this grid is shared by NATO members and EU members. And so if Russian actors target the Ukrainian grid, could this be considered as an attack against the European Union's critical infrastructure? I mean, we don't entirely know the answers to those questions right now because we're entering a new generation of warfare. But we haven't seen large-scale Russian cyber team action yet. So my first question for the panel is, why haven't we seen the Russians bring out their cyber warfare A-team yet?
So that's really interesting. First of all, that you brought up that they have been trying to get away from the Russian power grid since about, was that 2017 you said, Desmo?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see then that for a while they have been preemptively taking steps to disconnect from that Russian grid. I mean, the Ukrainians, definitely saw this invasion coming for a very long time. So, I mean, one would argue that they probably saw it coming even before the events of 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. Back to your primary question there as to why we haven't seen that, quote unquote, real Russian cyber warfare A-team, as we've referred it to, and that is definitely true. I don't believe we have seen the full power of Russian cyber capabilities by any stretch yet. We definitely have seen them use some cyber warfare techniques in Ukraine on both their communications infrastructure as well as some of their government websites and stuff. We haven't seen very much in the way of them targeting power grid infrastructure. We have through sabotage. One thing I talked about on the show a few weeks back was that we usually, like here in the States or in Europe, for instance, a lot of that that power grid infrastructure has been upgraded in certain places, especially in really populated cities and in city centers. That power grid infrastructure has been updated, and there is a large share of internet connected devices, so to speak, on that infrastructure. And so in some places, those can be exploited, through different cyber warfare techniques. However, I think why we haven't seen it in a lot of portions in and around Ukraine is because a lot of that infrastructure in Ukraine is, and I'm not, 100% sure on this, of course, but I believe that a lot of that infrastructure is fairly outdated, and a lot of the control infrastructure in place isn't directly exploitable, from the internet through cyber means. But yeah, I definitely agree that we haven't seen the full extent of those Russian cyber capabilities for sure.
So my follow-up question to that is, are we going to be seeing the Russian big boss hackers come out, or do we think that they might be holding them back for potential use against the West and or America?
I think that people. I have a bit of a background in IT, so I can speak to this very well. I think people are slightly overestimating the Russian state hacking capabilities. If you look at what type of attacks come out of Russia, so you can divide attacks up into two categories, roughly. You have criminal enterprise type attacks. These are for profit by individuals or groups non-affiliated with the state. And then you have state attacks. While you see a lot of criminal attacks, like all of the major crypto encryption viruses that have come out, ransomware, things like that have come out of Russia, you don't see a lot of state attacks out of them. State attacks you tend to see more of from North Korea and China, because in Russia there's more money to be made in just doing something criminal against the West than working for the government. I don't know that they have extensive cyber capabilities compared to some of the things you see out of China or North Korea.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, some of these attacks, like the ones in 2016, they're more opportunistic than they are tactical, right? Like it takes time to infiltrate and build yourself up in a way that you can actually exploit the grid in that way that they did in 2016, 2015.
And it's also worth noting that if they're wanting to use this power grid, because obviously Russia's end goal is to capture the country. If they're wanting to use this grid in the immediate aftermath, it's actually advantageous to more so cripple it down to a low level of functionality than to completely take it out, because power grids, a lot of people think that power grids work similar to a battery where they just draw as much power as is needed, but in reality, you have to balance your output with your consumption. You can't have too much output or too little consumption. You have to keep it balanced, because you have to keep the power grid very specifically tuned to the frequency your country runs off of. For Europe, that's 50 hertz. And the way this is done is by, if the consumption grows too great, they load shed, and this is done automatically by either computers or, in older cases, mechanical relays. But when that happens, you can enter a cycle of where you're load shedding and then spiking, and load shedding and then spiking again, and this can cause the frequency of the power grid to drop. And if that happens, there are automated systems that will shut down the power plants and essentially black out your whole grid. And once you've gone black, it can take literally months, even under perfect conditions, to restart your grid. So I suspect Russia may not want to completely take the grid offline in the end. It would be highly disadvantageous to them.
That's a very good point. Sabotaging a country's infrastructure that you're planning on taking is not the smartest move.
Also, I think they might know that they're also vulnerable from hacking as well.
I think I guess to answer your question before, Desmo, about the ramifications regarding NATO. NATO in 2019, the leader of the Secretary General of the NATO has said that any cyber attack that is indeed attacking the civilian or military infrastructure of a NATO state is considered an Article 5 response. I posted a link there where Jens Stoltenberg actually was very clear in his comments, and I believe he has made recent comments to that effect as well. I think that the difficulty here is first, Russia has had a lot of training from the Chinese. We know the Chinese are very good at the cyber security realm and are very good at cyber attacks. And through their cooperation and their alliances that they have made, I have read articles in the past, and I do apologize I don't have them currently, that there was close military training between the two powers, particularly in relation to cyber attacks. So I have no doubt that the big guns of the Russian military and their cyber security and cyber attack parts of that are capable of doing that at any time. I think the big question is why do they want to do that? Under international humanitarian law, it would be considered, especially if they went for electricity infrastructure. No one having electricity in Ukraine, as it currently stands, would be an indiscriminate attack on the civilian population. The law isn't not necessarily clear, but considering the Putin has already been referred to the International Criminal Court, and so has the Russian government, I would not be surprised if that's added to the list of things that would be indiscriminate in and of itself.
Okay. So I want to circle back to a bit of Article 5 chicanery. If, let's say, there was a cyber attack on a Polish hospital and a bunch of Polish people died, or there were American troops that were in a car and there was a cyber attack on the traffic lights and they got into a fatal accident, and this happens in Poland, but it's not a directly attributable cyber attack. What do we think the response is?
So, hospitals are something that are protected under the laws of war. Essentially, it's rateable to the same as a crime against humanity. When you're targeting a hospital, whether it's military or civilian especially. So when there's hospitals that are standing even in an active war zone, even if they are not occupied, it still is a war crime to try to destroy those buildings, because once the conflict dies down, all of a sudden the community which relied on that hospital no longer has it as a resource because it's been wrecked. And it's not even at that point about injuring or killing any civilians, but the fact that the building's been destroyed and it can no longer be used.
I think
I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm pressing my Alt key. Going, okay, is no one talking? Oops, sorry. I think, Desmo, you're right. When it comes to that, and the internet is not very it can be very anonymous. So to find who is a state actor and whether it is Russia, I think would be quite difficult. though recently they have attacks on Ukraine. I know Australian experts have gone to help with cybersecurity in Ukraine many months ago. So has NATO and the US. So they have been able to attribute attacks on Ukraine to the Russians in times past. So, but yeah, if there is no clear definition on who did it, there would be a lot of digging. I've read an article. I watched actually a documentary. I believe it was from. It was from a reputable news source. They were talking about attacks on nuclear. I mean, this is similar but different. Attacks on NATO, cyber attacks on NATO nuclear installations, and what would happen. And one of the experts actually said it takes time, but eventually you can find out if it's the state actor who did it. Because of look, I'm not a computer expert. Like maybe you can comment on this Cyberstorm, but the underlying aspects of, say, malware or anything else that affects the systems, you can eventually find out where it came from. Just takes time. I think the immediate response would be pointing the finger at Russia, but I think militarily, because everyone is on such high alert, and because NATO and Russia are playing a game of chicken, and from a military standpoint, I do find that it does risk escalation when you don't know who did it.
So I have a couple of points. I'm sorry. I just had a couple of points I would like to make. Let me mute the stream here because I can hear myself. Okay. All right. So as far as determining the location goes, there are various ways that state actors can use to spoof their locations. So it isn't 100% as to whether or not you could actually find out that information. I mean, I'm sure government agencies have better means than what's public information, but as far as public information goes, it's really difficult to actually pin down a source because that source itself can be spoofed. And then the second thing that I wanted to add, as far as NATO escalation goes regarding hacks, is that Jens Stoltenberg, who is the I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact term, but he's the head of NATO, and essentially he said that if any strikes or any hacks come from Russia, that it's going to trigger an Article 5 response.
Okay, so on the topic of determining if it's state actors or not, basically there's two things that you look at. First off is capabilities employed, and the second part is what the end goal of the attack was, which is usually fairly easy to figure out once you've discovered it and you've stopped it and you're just going back analyzing your data. On the first point, if you see a lot of 0 days, things like that, and meaning more than one, like multiple chained together, you're probably looking at something coming out of a state sponsored work crew, just because. So there are these firms that have bounties for 0 days, and they will sell them to state governments. There's multiple firms like that. Generally speaking, criminals, they don't have access to a lot of 0 days. They might have 1 or 2, but you're not going to see 3 or 4 chained like you will in a state-sponsored attack. And on the second part, on end goal, and this is really more determinant than anything else, criminals, when they go to hack something, obviously their end goal is profit. They're going to profit from it in some way. That might be encrypting your data. That might be stealing your personal information. It could be things like that. If there's no obvious way for them to profit from it, that's going to be a good indication. And there has been one actual incident that actually was a cyber attack that threatened human life. Basically, about 10 years ago, there was a Saudi Arabian oil refinery, and they were having a problem with one of their network switches. And they started looking for the cause to that, and in the process, they noticed that a lot of their safety sensors had suddenly started just looping the same data over and over again. And they come to find out these safety sensors have been infected and basically had their firmware rewritten so that they just send out a green signal all the time. And basically the end goal of this would have been the oil refinery would have exploded. And that's the only known instance of a cyber attack which showed both the obvious intent and the capability to harm human life. Because keep in mind, the only reason it was discovered was because they were looking into an unrelated problem. And that's an example of something you're obviously looking at state actor, because criminal groups, they don't profit from blowing up an oil refinery. If anybody else wants to continue from there.
So yeah, I think those are pretty valid points. If I could just touch on a few other points here. So I mean, I don't know if a lot of you remember the Colonial pipeline hack that happened earlier in the year. I believe that was in June of 2021 that happened. So that later came out that that was performed by a DarkSide. A hacker group that is affiliated with a Russian hacker group that has been known to be possibly affiliated with the Kremlin. I think the Kremlin, when we talk about the Kremlin's A-team here for for their cyber warfare division, I believe it's not just compromised of military personnel, like that are actually under the banner of the Russian military, but I believe they also use some of these other groups as contractors in certain cases, and I believe that in a way, Colonial pipeline was kind of a beta test for some of the other attacks that we could see. If we do see attacks made by the Russian state, if we do see cyber attacks by the Russian state, it will be very similar to the Colonial pipeline hack in that it'll be on most likely fuel infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and power infrastructure. And I think also in the way that it'll be unlike that Colonial pipeline hack is, instead of seeing things like ransomware used, we're going to see a lot more of what the other gentleman just said there, of what is known as zero-day exploits. Okay, and so again, I think if we do see the Russians carry out a cyber attack, it'll most likely be in retaliation for continued sanctions or some activity by the U.S. This could already be in the works by the Russian government in response to the sanctions that are being put in place now. If that could be unleashed against Ukraine, that could be unleashed against Europe or the States even potentially. But I think again, back to them using kind of that criminal element, like groups like DarkSide, right? Groups, some of those Russian hacking groups that have been known to possibly affiliate with the Kremlin itself. They'll probably use groups like that so they can, direct blame to them, or possibly even, make it look like the attacks came from outside of Russia. But I definitely think we're going to see a combination of that tactic, so making it look like it's not the Russian state, but instead make it look like it is one of those groups. And at the same time, we're probably going to see some very novel zero-day exploits that we haven't seen before at use. That's my best guess as to what we will see if we do see an escalation from Russia in a cyber capacity.
I think Ivy had a point that she wanted to make.
I think it's too far back. I was just going to say that NATO has some pretty specific language out about Russian cyber attacks and what or how it could trigger an Article 5. Basically, the language just says is whatever the attack was, it would have to cause some pretty serious physical damage or death for them. Like I think the exact language was cause substantial loss of life or considerable physical or economic damage for NATO to react. That was it. Sorry.
All right. So, moving on, if Russia is not currently planning, let's just speculate for a moment that Russia's not currently planning to attack NATO cyber targets. What do we think are the possible cyber targets within Ukraine that are either being probed or attacked at the present moment?
100% communications infrastructure in and around Kiev and the more populated cities. They're definitely looking to target, we've already seen evidence of them targeting some of the ISPs directly in Ukraine, targeting some of that backbone internet infrastructure. Of course, we heard the famous lines from our CNN Hot Mic reporters. They were, saying don't plug in the modems, etc. And we've seen a lot of evidence of some of those exploits that Russia has taken against some of that communications infrastructure. If we see more, I believe it'll be probably first on communications infrastructure. Secondly, it would most likely be on things like water infrastructure, like pumping stations, electrical substations, even possibly. Further attacks on power grid infrastructure. However, that would be in tandem with the current kinetic sabotage that we're seeing already taking place on the ground. But my first biggest guess, I think, would be probably communications infrastructure.
Yeah, I'd agree. We actually already seen several communications networks go down in Ukraine, like their Ukrainian cell phone networks. I can't remember what they're called, but a lot of them went down in the early days of the conflict. One thing that I did want to point out is that a lot of Russian electronic warfare elements are likely focused on protecting their command and control elements. And what I mean by that is, for example, they have this platform that they use called the Krasuka 4, which can be used to essentially mask movements, so they can encrypt their communications. They can also hide where a drone is flying. So I'm pretty sure that's where a lot of their elements are focused right now.
I just wanted to add on that. I think one of the targets, and I completely agree with you on this. What the targets would be communications, and anything they can do to disrupt military communications, or definitely communications from the Ukrainian government to the outside world. So, for example, I posted up something that I found really interesting a couple of weeks ago was someone saying that if you have a mobile phone and you're in a bunker, your phone can be geolocated by Russian units if they wanted to. Now, I would be interested to see if they did go out on a full-on cyber attack, whether they would target President Zelensky's and his office in ability to get information from the outside world, particularly because they are surrounding Kiev at the moment. And I think that's a big concern. And I'm very happy that Australian security forces are there to help with cybersecurity, or have been there to at least help with the cyber defense, because that sort of infrastructure would stop the command and control being more easily communicated to the Ukrainian forces.
And it's worth noting that a lot of people think that if you just hit that little GPS off button on the top of your phone, or even you just hit airplane mode, that you're shutting your GPS off. All you're really doing is you're telling your phone, hey, I know you have this capability, but please don't look at it right now. That capability is still physically present in the hardware, and if your device is compromised, it's not easy, but it's extremely possible to just flip that switch back on and not tell the end user. And in cases where that's a very major concern, and I would be surprised if President Zelensky doesn't have such a device. There are companies that take off-the-shelf phones and modify them and physically remove those GPS chips from the phone.
I think you need to turn your volume down just like a couple notches.
I'm sorry, I've been told I have a nuclear microphone. But,
is that you? You're that guy?
Correct, sir.
But it's very possible that Zelensky's personal devices, if he even has them on him, have been physically modified so that they no longer have the capability to geolocate him.
It's possible. It could be as simple as getting some copper plate and throwing it in a box most of the day. I know personally, as a software-defined radio enthusiast, I have been able to create an IMSI scanner and sort of, just with a $150 radio and a bit of software, find out all of the serial numbers, or temporary, they're called TIMSIs, temporary identifier, blah blah blah, of the cell radios themselves and their signal strength. So it's not that difficult to really track down where an individual cell phone is if you have just a little bit of technical knowledge and capability.
I just want to point out a comment that was on the stream that said Shayla Moon 91 wrote, "The thing can be tracked until the moment it's blown up in a pile of tannerite, and then the remaining chunks thrown into a lake." So look, I worry something that's never been discussed anywhere in regards to the cybersecurity, which it links in very well. There is the GRU in Ukraine, the spies, the spy networks. I mean, I believe that has been preparing this for years and years and years. It's not just something that he came up, woke up one day and said, "I'm going to invade Ukraine." So, I am 100% sure there's spies in Kiev that are under the radar, and I do worry about their clandestine operations, particularly regarding implanting something like what you were saying, Desmo, in relation to cybersecurity and locations of important people who are in the command and control network.
And yeah, that was another point that I wanted to touch on, and you kind of mentioned it there by accident. So basically, a lot of critical infrastructure, meaning the infrastructure that your country can't run without, like for example, the command and control computers for a nuclear reactor, they're air gapped. They're not physically connected to the internet. So the only way that you can get a virus onto there is to have physical access to the location. And this has been done once before when we sabotaged Iran's nuclear centrifuges. Literally, all we did was put the virus on a flash drive and we dropped it in the parking lot, and sure enough, somebody plugged it in. So if they have people on the inside, there's no telling what they could do. Those air-gapped systems, I would hope that they have them guarded. Because that's the worst case scenario, is a man on the inside with physical access to the hardware. There's a saying in IT, all your software security doesn't matter if somebody has physical access to the computer server. Once you have physical access, that's GG.
So I want to move the conversation a little bit forward. The 20th century has really been dominated by these military alliances, whether it's NATO, the USSR, or the post-Soviet kind of alliance group that's NATO-esque that was created, whose name escapes me at the moment. But my question is, will the 2020s and the century in front of us see the establishment of technological alliances?
I would argue that we're probably already seeing that. I mean, right along with NATO, as they try to coordinate in the cyber realm and try to kind of prepare for some of these possible eventualities, try to patch some of these vulnerabilities, and prepare for some of these novel exploits that we're going to see, as the years go on. And now, one thing you're talking about, in the future, going down the road, we're going to see things, crazy advancements when it comes to cyber warfare. One of the biggest is going to be the advent of using things like quantum computers for brute force attacks. Quantum computing will definitely change the playing field for sure when it comes to cyber warfare capability going forward. But back to the alliances, I think we're already kind of seeing that now, take place with organizations like NATO, as these countries try to coordinate with each other, to have plans in place, to have kind of backup plans, worst case scenarios in place, if some of these events do take place, and how they will, defend against some of these attacks and some of these exploits in the future. But again, I think we're going to see a larger quantity of novel exploits, okay, meaning things we haven't seen before, cyber warfare techniques that we haven't seen used before, especially as new technologies come to the playing field, especially as cyber capabilities, become more advanced, as computers get more powerful, things like, again, quantum computers are really going to make a difference. In fact, I believe the U.S. military is most likely already looking into things like quantum computing and how that's going to change the playing field when it comes to cyber warfare.
It's worth noting that on the topic of technological alliances, just a few months ago, the U.S. had actually classified cyber exploits as munitions. That means now, let's say you find an exploit in Microsoft Windows, you now need an export license to export that to other countries, the same as if you wanted to export, say, a bomb. So I think you're definitely onto something with us already being in that area of technological alliances. We're literally treating them as weapons legally.
So how do you think that would influence cyber attacks? Would substantial cyber attacks be enough to trigger Article 5 under NATO?
Again, I just want to stress that Jens Stoltenberg, who is the head of NATO, said that cyber attacks against NATO countries could trigger Article 5.
I think it's most likely, if we did see an Article 5 being triggered, it would have to be, again, right back to the Colonial pipeline and how I thought that, I was talking about how that's kind of like a beta test. I think if we saw Article 5 triggered, it would be in response for an attack, on a scale like the Colonial pipeline attack, but tenfold. Okay, you're talking about an attack on probably fuel infrastructure and power grid infrastructure nationwide, maybe even globally. It could be like something like kind of like Stuxnet. Basically like an indiscriminate novel attack, some kind of indiscriminate novel exploit, that they can implement and make it look like it's not, them, all right? Kind of direct the blame. And if they do that, I think, again, it will be targeted towards specifically, most likely, power grid infrastructure, maybe communications infrastructure. We've even seen signs of, of those attacks possibly taking place over the past few weeks, as we've seen, massive internet outages. We saw possible DNS attacks last week. Again, those were never, confirmed to be, attacks that came from any one origin or not. I believe they actually found the root cause as some DNS errors on Google Cloud infrastructure, if I'm not mistaken. But again, I think, if we do see any of these attacks take place, they're going to be on some kind of critical infrastructure. I believe things like, that Colonial pipeline hack is what we're going to see instead of direct attacks on communication infrastructure. If we did, it would be, again, direct attacks on probably DNS infrastructure, which would have a very widespread effect. Think about this for a second. If Russia was able to successfully conduct an attack of such a scale, I mean, they don't even need to directly target our market infrastructure, like our economic infrastructure, things like our stock markets, the stock indexes, the banking infrastructure. They don't need to directly target that stuff. They can, target things that are easier to exploit. But in doing so, right, in the chaos that ensues, will have huge tolls on our economy, and so I think that's more likely what we're going to see.
I think I'm trying to find the documentary I watched so I can post in the Situation Room and for others to see it. And indeed, the information there I think is critical. I agree with you, Omni, because attacks on some crucial networks, such as the nuclear infrastructure that exists in the United Kingdom, for example, cyber attacks on the actual nuclear infrastructure which exists worldwide, particularly in Europe, from both a nuclear point of view and then from even a conventional point of view, talking about radars, satellite infrastructure. There's so much hardware that can be attacked that there's so much. My apologies. There's so much, I guess, attacks that could take place that are considered very, very damaging. For example, taking out Poland's completely taking out Poland's electrical infrastructure would be one such Article 5 response. I had an article that I was going to post that I have ready for the situation where, last year there's been the US threatened that it can respond with nuclear weapons should there be a cyber attack on US mainland. Whether that applies to an Article 5 response, I think is a question and a concern. I would say it's mainly on the US mainland, but there are definitely major attacks that can happen. One of the things in that documentary it proposes, and it does list out, is that attacks on infrastructure which is made to prohibit accurate targeting and the use of nuclear weapons, particularly in Europe, is a major concern. There's in UK, I forgot what it was called. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's some sort of both used from a conventional missile point of view and a nuclear missile point of view. It's a radar that can track the missiles that are launched from Russia and also conventional missiles that are launched from Russia as well. And the disabling that with a cyber attack, for example, would make that the NATO alliance blind and would definitely trigger Article 5.
So I'd like to move on from specifics and put the conversation to a bit of a broader scope. So, multiple companies are currently investing into establishing silicon fabrication plants in America. TSMC, Intel, and Samsung are some of them. But the construction of these plants is contingent on America making its own investment into them by passing the CHIPS Act. I think it might have gotten through Congress, but I'm not sure on that just yet. My question for the panel is, does America have the political will to make the long-term, multi-administration investment required to establish partial or total silicon independence?
I think we do. I've been following this pretty closely as I've made clear. I'm involved in technology. And really, it's very bipartisan by American standards. I mean, it's had a few opponents here and there, but I think both sides have realized that we have a critical national security issue in that we're so reliant on foreign chip fabs. And it's also a boost to our economy, a massive boost if we can produce our own chips stateside without having to import them from either Taiwan, China, or South Korea. So I think yes, and that's very rare for American politics.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. It's a very bipartisan issue, which is very rare in American politics.
All right, well, considering that's a settled question, does anyone have any opinions on the on the implications of Taiwan and South Korea sanctioning Russia and preventing them access to the output of their fabs?
In the short term, I don't think it's going to have much effect, but if this crisis continues and the sanctions hold out, it's going to have a serious effect, unless Russia could stand up its own chip development industry, which is something I doubt.
Okay.
So, under the CHIPS Act, does it specify the type of technology? Like, for example, if the United States were to develop, I don't know how related quantum computing is to chips, or specifically to the CHIPS Act, would we be keeping that kind of technology in-house? Would we be sharing this kind of technology with NATO allies? Would we export it in general? How would we be treating this new technology?
I feel like access to that technology is or would be treated as a highly classified national asset. I have a feeling that members of the Five Eyes would have access to its output and might be able to make requests of things to put into the quantum computer, but I seriously doubt that anyone outside the United States would get the keys to the kingdom.
Because would this be a type of technology that's easily replicated? For example, when people were analyzing the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there wasn't anything really to analyze because the bombs themselves were vaporized in pieces. But these chips, even if they were to export them to allies, now they have the means to reproduce these items.
I think another angle of this too that we got to remember is that, as the U.S. looks to create, back to the chip factories, as the U.S. looks to, bring a lot of that manufacturing, a lot of that chip manufacturing here to the States, I think the big problem here is going to be sourcing raw materials. And I think that's definitely something that we're going to be looking into further in the country, is getting some of these rare earth metals, and the demand. Then now that there's factories, TMC, of course, has factories in in Asia, and they're now going to have factories here in the States as well. So there's going to be higher demands, of course, continuing forward into the future as the demand gets higher for for phones, as the as the use of chips in our cars increases, there's going to be a larger increase on these rare earth metals, and I think that all ties back into some of the geopolitical events that we're seeing take place now, including the events in Ukraine, and China's moves towards Taiwan, of course. So it all kind of plays together on this geopolitical chessboard right now. And as we move into the future, I think the domestic the move to domestically be producing these chips is also going to kind of affect how our geopolitical influence is projected on the world. As for moving for these resources, we need these resources. How are we going to get them? By what means are we going to pursue them? Right on the geopolitical playing field, and again, I think a lot of this ties right back into some of the moves we're seeing happening here in real time. Right back to what Klusa was saying though about quantum computers and kind of the relation in that to the how like the reverse engineering, and kind of the relation to the Manhattan Project that you made there, the reference to that. I believe that is very correct. There's definitely a large effort by China and Russia to conduct espionage, to find out the details of some of these projects that the U.S. government, of course, is working on. And as time goes on, things like quantum computing are definitely going to be that information is definitely going to be highly contested and highly sought after. I definitely think that we'll probably see escalations by China as they try to get their hands on some of this technology moving forward. And look to implement it, for their own means. As I said earlier, I guarantee that, the U.S. military is already looking into this technology and looking into ways to use it on the battlefield for everything from neural networking to, as I was saying earlier, brute force exploits. With that kind of computational power, it's akin to the atom bomb, essentially. The ability that that amount of computational power would have in the hands of a large government such as the United States would be would have a monumental effect, on whatever country they deem to wield it on.
So my final question for this topic, and then we can move back to the battle discussion. Now that we're approaching the limits of sanctions, are there any remaining deterrents against anonymous Russian cyber attacks?
I think the only remaining deterrent is the threat of Western cyber attacks against Russia.
Yeah, the idea of Article 5. I believe is the thing that's really holding back right now. I mean, other than that, I feel like a lot of our infrastructure is extremely vulnerable. We have done a very good job over the past 5 years of patching things up. We've seen the government, putting together cyber task forces, for a multitude of different areas of concern, to kind of get some of those security vulnerabilities mitigated. But again, I think the majority of our infrastructure is extremely vulnerable, and as the years go on, as time goes on, we're going to see a lot of those security vulnerabilities get patched, of course. But I think right now in our current state, there's not a lot holding back Russia, from wielding some of these, zero-day exploits if they do have them in their arsenal. There's nothing really stopping them from using those and carrying them out successfully, aside from U.S. intelligence and their capabilities of keeping a step ahead of those events.
I guess one last question that I would have also with the cyber attacks and related to Article 5. If NATO were to implement Article 5 over a cyber attack, is it going to be a proportional response of Article 5? Is it going to be there is a very bad cyber attack that happens on NATO, and NATO responds with conventional warfare and unconventional warfare?
I think that's very unlikely. I think what we'll see. Sorry, just to chime in here. I think we'll see. If we do see an Article 5 response, we would see an equal to or less than response. So something like increased sanctions, or like some more sanctions, or maybe even like embargoing or something like that, in combination with retaliatory cyber attack. We would probably see that before they would choose to conduct kinetic warfare, because that's a huge step above any cyber attack. Of course, if lives are lost in result to a cyber attack, that might change things. But again, I don't see that as likely. I see it more likely that they would conduct these attacks on critical energy infrastructure. That would probably be the most probable, because that's the most vulnerable, and B, would have the biggest impact. If that did occur, I think we would most likely see just a retaliatory attack, by cyber means. Either that or just continued financial retaliation in some form.
So they would keep the attack proportional.
Yes, either that or even less than, either proportional or less than. I would say. Again, I kind of I reiterate that I think under any circumstances, when it comes to Russia launching a cyber attack, I believe even if there were lives lost, that step of jumping to kinetic retaliation, traditional conventional retaliation, conventional warfare, that would be a big step, and I think there's too much on the line before we would jump that far. I think we would more than likely take equal to or lesser action, obviously in the means of, in the form of cyber attack, or again, increased sanctions, some kind of embargo or embargoing, some kind of blockade, even possibly, so that Russia, to increase that financial grip on Russia and the Kremlin. I don't know. It's anybody's guess, really, but I don't think that we would resort to a kinetic response.
All right, so I think we've covered everything we can about Russian cyber attacks. I feel like further discussion would just be pure speculation. So why don't we circle back to the conflict in Ukraine? Can anyone tell me about the strikes that have been happening recently?
So in Kiev, there were allegedly two cruise missiles that struck the capital a few hours ago. I say allegedly because we weren't able to identify what exactly the projectile was. However, on an analysis of the recordings, when these projectiles fell, it was clear that they were self-propelled, meaning that they have propulsion behind them. So, for example, when a mortar is launched or an artillery shell is fired, the propulsion comes from all of the inertia that's gathered inside the gun itself, inside the cannon. So that rocket or that mortar shell flies, and it'll continue to go with its own momentum. However, these two strikes that we saw, these two explosives, they were self-propelled and they were pretty large, so there is a very good chance that they were cruise missiles. But they did strike the capital, and this seemed to be more damage as a result than what we have previously seen on the capital.
Injection?
Please do.
I'm sorry. Trying to equate the amount of ordnance being pounded on Ukraine is exactly too much for me at this time in the morning. It's 7 o'clock in the morning, Scottish time. I'm half drowsy, or otherwise known as drunk. So I'm finding it hard to equate my head with correlating numbers at ordnance, as I said, hitting Ukraine, be it 2 supposedly cruise missiles, several hundred tactical ordnance ammunitions. I'm going to have to excuse myself, and thank you all for having me along, but ta-ra, I'm out.
Thank you so much for being on the show tonight, Epi. We're always glad to have you.
Yeah, actually, I'm still here, but I cannot. The technicalities of equating this kind of information, it's not for me. I'm sorry. I'm more interested in the actuations of how the field is moving, not each explosion.
So back to the explosions really quick, if I may. I believe over the past 12 hours, we have seen probably the most kinetic bombardment in Ukraine that we've seen in the past 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. I believe the amount of siren alerts that we had last night, the amount of reports that we've gotten in of shellings, missile strikes, and bombardments, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, last night might take the cake so far for activity. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely. And the idea that conversing over the possibility of 2 cruise strikes for 10 minutes is going to blow my fucking head. That's why I interjected there, excuse my French. But yeah, fully agree. The past day or so, indiscriminate acts of fucking terror on a nation is disheartening to me, to say the least. Sorry, I don't know.
Especially Kiev. I'm not sure if this was the first time that Kiev was actually hit with cruise missiles.
Was last night strikes that we saw on the Oasis camp? I believe those were shells, artillery shelling, if I'm not mistaken. Correct?
I strongly believe that those are cruise missiles, because artillery shells, you don't see them falling back towards the ground. Because they're not self-propelled. So initially, it's just an object that falls. There's no like something you'd see out of the back of a jet engine where there's flame. This, however, you can clearly see the projectile, and it looked much like the cruise missile that struck Iran 2 days ago, where you can see the self-propulsion.
You mean Iraq?
Missile into the ground. Iraq, yes, I'm sorry. The Iraq, the missile launched by Iran into Iraq. Yeah, when you see the video, you can see the self-propulsion behind those projectiles, whereas with artillery you wouldn't see that.
Desmo, do you have a closing topic? I think we could start closing up now if you have a closing topic for us.
I have written all that I can write tonight. I think I am out of topics.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I believe we're going to end tonight's community panel discussion. I really like the way it went tonight. I believe it was. I believe the format in which we conducted tonight's discussion was very well. I think what we should try to do is aim for maybe a 3 with the way with the rate that this discussion moved tonight. I believe going forward, we'll try to conduct it in a format of maybe 3 topics per night. Maybe the top 3 topics, of the past day or two we can cover, and I believe that would be a good format going forward. I believe it worked really well. If any of you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself or to plug anything, you can go ahead and do so now. I will also, if any of you want to send over any links maybe to social media, or if you guys have a YouTube channel or anything you would like to have in the description below the video. I'm going to be uploading this panel discussion as a video. We're going to start doing that now. After each panel discussion, we'll be uploading them to YouTube. And in the description, we will have links to where you guys can check out some of the speakers that you just heard here on this panel discussion. Now, at this time, if any of you would like to plug anything, you can do so. If not, feel free to stay silent. Anybody?
Sure, I'll go. I am Will, aka Cyberstorm. I don't have anything of my own to plug, but if you want to learn more about those cyber attacks I mentioned, check out Darknet Diaries by Jack Resider. Very useful info.
Hi, I'm Desmo, and I lead the writing team on the server. If any of you would like to suggest topics, whether you're listening on Twitch chat or on YouTube, or on the Discord itself, please just join the Discord and shoot me a direct message. My username is Desmo. And for those in YouTube chat, I specifically say circle back just to upset you.
Right on. Anybody else would like to take a moment to say something?
My name is Klusa. I mainly work with intercepting Russian radio comms using WebSDR. A lot of the equipment that the Russians have been using is fairly outdated, especially when the separatists. So being able to tune in, listen to their conversation, we did learn quite a bit. Yeah, not much else.
Anybody else?
Hi, I'm the Vladinator. I have a Bachelor of Laws, Bachelor of Arts. I have a focus in public international law, particularly humanitarian law and human rights. And I have studied global and international studies, so I know a lot about the history of the conflict, and I would recommend reading pretty much a wide variety of things, but one thing I would probably want to suggest to anyone who's interested in, I guess, the tailored damage theory is to read the March 2014 article of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists by Nikolai Sokov.
Alrighty, that's awesome. Anybody else would like to go ahead?
There's one thing I would like to add. If any of you guys are not too familiar with a lot of the jargon, there is a book. It is a fiction book, but it's called The Tomorrow War, and I personally know the author. He wrote this book himself as a military intelligence officer, and really there are a lot of parallels I noticed between what's going on in terms of especially the cyber warfare aspect, how the cyber attacks can cripple a country. A lot of terminology, and just overall, if you guys like reading fiction books, Tomorrow War is a really good one.
That's awesome. Maybe again, if anybody would like to
I
link
just
anything.
wanted to add, I'm Watchdog Intel. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm a private security specialist by day, and I do open source intelligence analysis by night. Yeah, check me out, Watchdog Intel on Twitter.
All right, awesome. I actually forgot to cue up my mic there. I was saying if anybody else wants to go ahead and discuss that. Who was the last one that just spoke there?
Me, I'm Watchdog.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, again, if anybody else would like to go ahead and plug anything.
I'd like to pipe up and plug you, sir. Thank you for giving all of us.
Thank you, Effie, man. We love you, man. Thank you again for tuning in. I guess if that's anybody, last call, anybody? Alrighty. Well, with that, guys, that wraps up tonight's panel discussion. We will be having another discussion tomorrow. We're trying to do these daily. Eventually, we'll get a concrete schedule in place. We haven't yet, as we're trying to, move through the motions here and kind of get kind of the format pinned down. Of course, there's going to be a couple growing pains, and so right now this is just kind of a an experiment, a work in progress here, but eventually we will have a schedule down where people can tune in to these panel discussions as they happen over the course of the day. Again, if anybody is looking for any of the links, if you're watching the video of this that has been uploaded, you can find all the links below the video in the description below. We'll also have a section there for any of the social media or any of the plugs that you guys heard there just a few moments ago. Also, check the description below. You can find links to our Discord server there. The link to that is discord.gg/NEMICO. Anybody is welcome to join. We have a very large community over there. There's a lot going on over there. We'd love to have you guys. There's also links in the description below to where you can donate directly to Ukraine. Also, there's a QR code now on the screen. You can use that to donate directly to the Red Cross Crisis Fund for Ukraine. There's also a fundraiser we're doing right now. We are selling shirts for Ukraine. If you'd like to support Ukraine, you can buy a shirt from our merch store. There's a link to that in the description below. All of the designs over there, even the NEMICO designs, not just the Ukraine ones, but all of the merch from our many merch stores are going to, all the funds are going directly to the Ukraine Crisis Funds. So you can find links to those in the description below the stream. If you're following along on YouTube, make sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. It's the best way to get notifications on when we have new videos uploaded or new streams go live. Also, it's the best way to support the channel. If you're watching along on Twitch, thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight. I love every single one of you guys over there on Twitch. Make sure to hit that follow button if you haven't already. And until next time, guys, this has been our open community, open mic discussion here. And we will see you guys back here tomorrow for the next one. In the meantime, our NEMICO Situation Room live stream is up 24/7. You can find that on our YouTube channel, of course, at youtube.com/NEMICO Network. Again, thank you guys very much, and good evening, and goodbye.
Good night, good morning, good
Slava
tomorrow.
Ukraini.
Yeah, Slava Ukraine. That's a good one right there.
Slava, Slava, Slava.
NEMICO, there's a very suspicious flight going into the middle of Russia. Are we off the stream?
Oh, well, we are now.
Okay, there's a very suspicious